Hello everyone and welcome to Chess with Arsalan. In this series of videos, which will start with this one, we are going to talk about Ruy Lopez variations and Ruy Lopez positions. And what we are going to start with is closed positions of Ruy Lopez. So the position that is in front of you. And in the first video, we are going to talk about positional aspects of pieces and pawns and how we can react and what are the consequences of our reactions. So let's start. Usually in this kind of positions, white builds up a center with d4. So the center of the white will be c3, d4, and e4. We have variations that pawn does not come to d4, it comes to d3. We are going to talk about that in the future. But the main one, usually what happens in the most of the games is that white tries to create a very strong center with c3, d4, and e4. And in response, black has a pawn structure in the center with d6 pawn and e5 pawn. And in the classic variations, usually the bishop is trapped behind these two pawns. Now, the first thing that black usually considers in this kind of position is that am I allowed to take on d4 and white recaptures with a c4 on c pawn. And this exchange can happen and sometimes happen in some variations, but positionally speaking, this is not a kind of exchange that black wants usually to happen. Why? Because black is basically exchanging a central pawn on e5 with a pawn on c3. So positionally speaking, this is not a desirable exchange. But sometimes things that we get in exchange with this exchange are actually worth it, and we do that kind of exchange. For example, sometimes black tries to open e5 e file in order to exert pressure on the e4 pawn. Sometimes black wants to create a majority pawn in the queen side with c5. We see this in Zaitsev variation, for example, where black ends up with a majority of 3 against 2 in the queen side, which can be decisive in the end game or even middle game. We will talk about that later. But at the first glance, positionally speaking, this is not the kind of exchange that black wants to do. In return, white is also uh, is not very eager or without reason to play d takes e5. Why? Because if white plays d takes e5, after d takes e5, positionally speaking, without any compensation, you are actually basically freeing the bishop from e7, and this bishop can actually relocate itself to a better diagonal. For example, the best one would be g1 a7 diagonal. So if white does this exchange, it should come with a very good reason for white, because white is removing the tension from the center and white is releasing the bishop from e7. Another thing is that instead of this exchange, if white decides to close the center with d5, this one also should come with a very good reason. Why? Because again, positionally speaking, you are removing the tension from the center, you are closing a to g8 diagonal where the bishop is located, and sometimes closing this diagonal will actually affect the performance of this bishop, and presence of the bishop in this diagonal is so important that sometimes white in the opening wastes a move with a3 or a4 in order to keep the bishop in this diagonal. So be careful. If you are playing d5, it should come with a very good reason, and we will see those reasons when we analyze the variations. Now, the another point, another let's say element in the black's position is the pawn on b5. Why? Because this pawn can be a weakness in the black's position, because white can attack this pawn with a4, and after exchanging on b5 it can increase the pressure with knight a3 and queen e2. So black has to be very careful when he has a pawn on b5, because if black is not careful, this pawn can be a target in the queen side. And in response to a4, black has a couple of options. Number one, which is less desirable, is to exchange on b4. Of course, not in this position. in the positions of Ruy Lopez. But this is not a very good exchange at the first glance, because first of all, after, for example, taking on a4, there will be a pawn on a semi-open file, a file, and this pawn on a6 or sometimes in a5 can be a target for white's pieces. White can attack this pawn very easily because it is located on a semi-open file. Another reaction that black can have to this pawn is to advance it to the b4. This also comes with two additional problems. Number one is that white can separate the queenside pawns of black with a move like a5, and this separation causes weakness of these two. Moreover, it affects the activity of the c8 bishop, because sometimes black is trying to play a5 himself and develop the bishop from this diagonal, and this pawn on b4 will not be a very pleasant pawn. And another thing is that by playing b5 b4, you are actually vacating the square c4. So why this is important? As you know, one of the classic maneuvers in in Ruy Lopez for the knight on b1 is that white tries to develop his knight via d2 to f1 to g3 or e3. And most of the time, if the knight is on d2 and you play b4, you are actually vacating the c4 square for the knight, so the knight can jump into the c4, and on that square it can exert pressure to many parts of black's position. So be very careful if you are advancing with the pawn to the b4. This is one of the options, one of the strong options that white has in this kind of position. Now, we talked about the bishop on b3 and the importance of the a2 g8 diagonal, but we didn't say that why this diagonal is very important. There are many reasons. Number one is that this bishop is directly preventing black from freeing his position. There are two main ideas for black to free his position. Number one is to play f5 and exert pressure on f4, on e4, which is not possible, at least in this position, because this bishop, the bishop on b3, is actually pinning the pawn on f7. Idea number two is to play c6 and d5 and try to free himself, because after d5, black can develop his e7 bishop to another square. It will be freed. There will be more freedom for the bishop on c8. But again, the bishop on b3 is preventing black from easily carrying out this idea. And sometimes even there are other options for white. Now, we will talk about that when we reach to those positions. Now, there is another problematic piece for white, and it's the knight on b1. Why knight on b1 is a little bit problematic for white? Because of the center that white built with c3, the knight cannot come to its usual developing a square, c3. So it has to find another square, another important square to go to. And usually white develops his knight from d2 to f1 and to g3 or e3 in order to control f5 square. Now, the problem is that when the knight comes into the d2, sometimes black tries to interfere with this development. First of all, why? Because if knight reaches to the g3 square, it will have a great control over f5 square, and it can even jump into the f5 and control many squares on the black's camp. So sometimes black tries to interfere with that with for example, exchanging on d4 and placing a rook on e file and exerting pressure on the e4 square. So this is one of the mechanisms that black uses in order to delay this development. Another thing is that black can help this idea with developing his bishop to b7, because from this square black will be able to exert pressure on e4. So these are ideas that can interfere with development, with normal development of the knight on b1 from d2 to f1 to g3 or e3. Another problem that black has in this position is the backward pawn on c3, c7, excuse me. This pawn, if the c file opens, for example, if you play e takes d4 and c takes d4, this file, c file, will be opened, and this pawn will be a target for white to attack. So um, this usually doesn't happen in many variations, but sometimes black uses this disadvantage in order to attack white's center. For example, if white has a pawn on d5, black uses the c pawn with c6 and tries to create some sort of pressure on the d5. Or if white's pawn is on d4, black tries to attack the center with the c5. So although this pawn is a backward pawn, but sometimes black can use it as a weapon in order to attack the center of the white. So I think for today this will be a good introduction. In the future video, we are going to talk about initial moves after Ruy Lopez and explain them in order to have a better understanding of this opening. Until the next video, goodbye.